So I would like to welcome Sarah Garland, who's one of the Chief Sustainability Officers, Clinical Fellows at Greener NHS. She's currently working with HEE, or her fellowship's been with HEE, but more recently she's been getting involved with Greener AHP projects with the CAPO team. That's the Chief Allied Health Professions Officers team. And Sarah has over 20 years experience working in the NHS as a dietitian and is on the committee of the BDA Sustainable Diets Special Interest Group. And today is going to be talking about the BDA's One Blue Dot initiative. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Ben. So as I've mentioned, some of you will already be familiar with One Blue Dot, but for those of you who are not, I'll give you a sort of a brief explanation before we go into any more details. The British Dietetic Association is the professional body for dietitians in the UK, and several years ago now they produced One Blue Dot as a resource on environmentally sustainable diets. It was most recently updated in 2020, and the next update will soon be due. And I plan to spend the next 15 minutes or so speaking to you about One Blue Dot using slides from the resource pack. I'm sure some elements of it might be contentious, and there will be time after the presentation for us to discuss things further. So what do we know? We know that our diets are quite often bad for our health. The current high rate of obesity has resulted in an explosion of non-communicable diseases, which in the UK are impacting both on the NHS and on our economy. Obesity obviously increases the risk of people developing diabetes, and that in turn is the leading cause of preventable blindness and amputations in the UK. Obesity also increases the risk of heart disease, and that also has a huge impact on the well-being, morbidity and mortality in our population. And obesity is second only to smoking in terms of increasing risk of the main cancers, with the biggest associations for colon and breast cancer. So the situation is unsustainable economically, especially from a national healthcare cost perspective, with billions of pounds of cost to the NHS every year. We also know that our diets are bad for the planet. We're facing a climate crisis, the impacts of which are far-ranging and catastrophic for all living things on this planet. From the recent IPCC report, we know we're not on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And as we know, greenhouse gas emissions are responsible for global warming. A significant reduction in the production of greenhouse gases, if needed, to keep temperature rises as low as possible. Our food system is responsible for as much as 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So from that, we can realise that the food system needs to change. The good news is that improving our diets can be a win-win, addressing both climate change and the health concerns. From farm to fork to the bin, each stage of our food system has an environmental impact. Farming and manufacturing processes and the way we eat and dispose of food are damaging the planet. Taking into consideration farming, production, distribution, delivery through to waste, our current food system contributes 18 to 25% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the UK and approximately 20 to 30% globally. It is a leading cause of deforestation, biodiversity loss, and soil and water pollution around the world. It accounts for 70% of all human water use and 10 million tonnes of food produced is spoiled or wasted in the UK every year, with the majority of that occurring in the home. Most of this is avoidable and represents a waste of land, water, and other inputs, and produces unnecessary greenhouse gas emissions. Overfishing and poor fishing practices have impacted on fish populations, with 80% of fisheries now fully exploited and overfished. And the marine vertebrate population has been halved and ecosystems damaged. Agriculture and livestock farming are by far the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, biodiversity loss, soil pollution, as well as land and water use. So the food choices that healthcare professionals recommend to people have a direct impact on sustainability. Sustainability as a whole is determined by 3 key pillars: economic, social, and environmental. All of these are important, but the one blue dot focuses on the third, environmental. So this definition from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN is one of the main definitions of an environmentally sustainable diet. Sustainable diets are those with low environmental impacts, which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair, and affordable. Nutritionally adequate, safe, and healthy, while optimizing natural and human resources. From a health perspective, it's important that we emphasize that a sustainable diet must meet the nutrition and health needs of our population. Assessing the sustainability of food is complicated given the wide range of factors at play. On this slide, we have an explanation of how the impact of protein sources are commonly assessed. These figures are average values based on a combination of data sets from around the world. It's important to highlight that there will be significant variability depending on a range of factors, such as the country of origin, farming practices, dry or wet weather conditions, etc. The water stress considers several physical aspects relating to water resources, including water scarcity, but also water quality, environmental flows, and the accessibility of stored water for human consumption. Therefore, a product with high stress weighted water use implies it is using what's called blue water, storage water, as irrigation due to dry conditions, thereby depleting water stores that could have been used for human consumption in an area whose overall water levels are already scarce. Crops that rely more on rainfall will utilise more of what is called green water, thus their stress-weighted water use will be lower. Additionally, stress-weighted water use can include grey or polluted water use, which can be used in irrigation. What is interesting to note is that water use does not always correlate with the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can see on here, nut agriculture is water intensive, but nuts have the lowest greenhouse gas emissions per 100 gram protein. They do in fact use the most water when they are grown in regions where water is already scarce and receive little rainfall. So land use is obviously also significant, as this is land that might otherwise be used either to more efficiently produce protein from another source, or it might be that this land could be forested and thus have a positive impact on greenhouse gas emissions by taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And there's more detail that these figures can't express in terms of their exact nature of the land used. It's also important to acknowledge that these measures do not include Other factors such as water pollution, soil degradation, biodiversity, ecosystems, nitrogen and phosphorus. I've added this picture of the Eat Well Guide in because the next slide talks about changes to the Eat Well Guide, and I was conscious that not everyone would be familiar with it. So in the UK, the Eat Well Guide is a government produced resource that dietitians and many other healthcare professionals use to discuss healthy eating. It was reviewed back in 2016, incorporating sustainability factors for the first time. The Eat Well Guide aims to improve the balance of dietary intakes in the UK. One of the most notable changes was a focus on plant-based proteins over meat, with the corresponding section now called beans, pulses, fish, eggs, meat and other proteins, with a subheading to eat more beans and pulses, and a limit of red meat to no more than 70 grams per person per day. Other changes made were to reduce the dairy section by a third, to remove the high-fat, sugar and salt food section entirely, and a new small section on oils and vegetable spreads was added. Obviously, fruit and vegetables and starchy foods remain the biggest part of the guide. The Carbon Trust undertook a carbon footprint assessment, comparing current intakes using the National Diet and Nutrition Survey with the updated Eat Well Guide. And they found that if the population could adopt these dietary recommendations, the overall carbon footprint would be reduced by almost a third, with a 31% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 17% reduction in water use, and a 34% reduction in land use. They also established that changing the average diet to that recommended could increase average life expectancy by 4 to 5 months. A large proportion of the health benefits would come from the prevention of type 2 diabetes, and there was also benefit from prevention of cardiovascular disease and colorectal cancer anticipated. So this slide gives a bit of an overview of the content of One Blue Dot. Reducing, but not necessarily avoiding, red meat is highlighted as a priority for having the biggest environmental burden. And to break that down slightly, the transport of animal products represents 6% of related greenhouse gas emissions, while the production of feed and methane emissions represent 84%. Emphasis is on reduction rather than avoidance, as for some population groups, red meat could be a key source of iron and zinc. However, processed meat should be avoided, and these foods are also a source of salt and saturated fat in the diet. When reducing red meat, plant food sources of protein should be prioritised over other animal proteins. In other words, reduction in red meat should not be compensated for by increasing white meat consumption, such as chicken. Plant proteins have a much lower environmental burden and a more rounded nutritional profile. I've spoken a bit already about fish stocks and the impact of overfishing. This is the representation of fish in One Blue Dot is in contrast to current eating habits in the UK, where less than 1 serving of fish is achieved in the population. However, by focusing on more sustainably sourced freshwater and farm fish, One Blue Dot suggests we can meet the recommended 2 portions a week while still protecting fish stocks and minimising damage to the ecosystems. Dairy and alternatives are advised as some food group to be moderated. Dairy cattle have an environmental impact in the same way as beef cattle do. And when plant-based alternatives are used, One Blue Dot recommends calcium fortified versions. Fruit and particularly vegetable intakes should be increased, and One Blue Dot promotes buying seasonally and locally produced food and vegetables which are not grown in greenhouses. If out of season fruit and vegetables which are grown abroad are consumed, canned or frozen variants will be more sustainable. Any produce that is air freighted, pre-packed and or pre-prepared and grown in greenhouses should be discouraged. Portion control is also a priority for a more environmentally sustainable future. Overconsumption means excess food grown and produced, which will only exacerbate the environmental burdens. One Blue Dot advice supports existing advice to reduce intakes of energy-dense food, saturated fat, salt and sugar, while improving intakes of fibre, healthier fluids and micronutrients such as iron, zinc and calcium. Excuse me. Waste. We've mentioned food waste already. Perishable fruits and vegetables make up the majority of household food waste, which is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. The environmental impact of using more affordable frozen or tinned fruit and vegetables is not necessarily greater than opting for fresh produce, which will also require for refrigeration, might be air freighted and makes up the large proportion of food waste. You can probably tell that I've modified this slide slightly. I'm conscious that not everyone in the group would be a dietitian, and this slide set is focused on dietitians. Whilst dietitians do bring a specific skill set to this challenge, there is a role for all healthcare professionals in advocating for more sustainable food and nutrition, whether it be in hospitals or other healthcare settings, or in terms of the choices individuals make, or by influencing others within the food system. My final slide is just some links and resources that One Blue Dot suggests.